Last week we had covered some very important information. I'd like to review this information just slightly and then go into deeper, and we're going to be going into very, very heavy stuff now and probably the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I would urge all of you not to miss any particular share, because what we will be covering is very different and it's very unique. We will be analyzing, after we finish with some of the basic information tonight, we will begin to look into the actual events of history itself and try to give a basic explanation of why these things happen. We will be investigating the events that occurred to the Avos, to Avram, Yaakov, and to Yosef. We will be investigating then the Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the first and second temple. We will be investigating the explanation of the Golus. We will then move all the way up into medieval times and begin to discuss some very important things about the American and in modern history, the American and the French Revolution. We'll be going further, and we will also go into the current aspects of today, most recent history, into explaining to whatever extent we can the Holocaust and the birth of the State of Israel, using these basic principles that we discussed. So I would urge all of you to try and be present to the fullest degree that you can, because it's very unique information. Okay, the board looks nice and organized. Let me do the review on the basis of the board here. What we basically sought to understand, the essential question that we wanted to understand was, why are there so many different nations in the world? You have, for example, nations as varied as the Eskimos, the Zulu, the Aborigines, the Bushmen, the Chinese, the Indians, the English, the African, and so on. There's incredible variation among all these nations. We attempt to begin to understand why is there so much variation. Number one, and number two, why is it that nobody else in the world really has any idea of the existence of the Torah but the Jews? Really. If the Torah is the most critical document ever given to man, why is it that only the Jews have an idea of what it is and no one else really does? To put it more bluntly, what does God have to do with all the nations of the world besides the Jews? And I said this before, and I'll say it again, God is not Jewish. Meaning, we are Jewish, we have a certain obligation, we have a certain purpose. The Ribono Shel Olam, or God, is not Jewish in the sense that His authority, His will, and His power does not limit itself to the Jewish nation. He's the creator of all the universe, of all the nations of the world, of all people. He is in the consciousness of every living being, every living human. So when we look at the Ribono Shel Olam, we try and understand what does He have to do with the entire expanse called the human population, and the events called human history. It's much broader than that. And we will look for that information into the Torah itself. This is the key. We are going to try and create what's called a Torah history and a Torah anthropology. It is very different than anything that is given by the Goyim in the secular world, the secular studies of anthropology, the social sciences. We will see that the premises, the principles are vastly different, but these are the principles which are true. These principles which we will discuss tonight and which we have discussed before and which we will discuss up ahead are the basic principles which essentially govern human history. We of course can only discuss these principles in general forms. We cannot isolate these principles down to a specific nation really, or to a specific individual. To do that you would literally have to be a prophet, and even a prophet could not do that. To do that you have to be the Mashiach himself, and that kind of information awaits the Mashiach. But until that time we have to satisfy ourselves with a more general view of things, and you'd be surprised how detailed we can get even at that general level. Justice, din, mishpat, this is the essential attribute of the Ribono Shel Olam, the most important attribute of the Ribono Shel Olam, and the one that He built the entire world. All existence is based on the principle of justice. But we have said, without any real elaborate reviews, is that the Ribono Shel Olam created the world, this world, to serve as an opportunity for man to be tested or tried, so that he would be able to create or choose and thereby create his Olam Haba, the future life. eternal destiny. And we have said that at the outset, Adam Rishon was given the first opportunity. He failed. That opportunity was then given to his descendants. They failed until we come to the point when mankind was divided into two different species. We will see today that there are really four species. There are four general species of men. But at this point, we are only aware of two species of men. One species of man is called Yisrael, the Jew, and that species is an individual who essentially is defined by the fact that he has a neshama which has the capacity of transforming physical reality into a spiritual reality that lasts for all eternity. He can create an olam haba. He's got the power to do that in his neshama. He has the power collectively with all Jews to do that. Other Rishon had that power individually. Now all Jews have that power collectively. But the distinctive factor of a Jew is the fact that he has a soul, a neshama, which when he performs the mitzvot and he becomes intimate with the Rebbeinu Shalom in a specific, unique relationship, when he does the will of the Rebbeinu Shalom and knows the Rebbeinu Shalom in that way, what happens is he brings down into his neshama a very unique power, spiritual power, which infuses his neshama and allows his neshama to thereby completely radically transform all physical reality, including his body, and this entire existence becomes an eternal one called Olam Haba. Only the Jews retained that power. Other Rishon had that power. At first, mankind was given that power and allowed it to remain. But by the time mankind was 20 generations away from Adam Rishon, that power was already, to some degree, confiscated from men. So that what you found by the time the revelation of Torah came about on Har Sinai, you found that two species of human beings were created. Rather, really one species was created. At the outset, the Rebbeinu Shalom only created one type of man. The essence of man lies in his ability to conquer all spiritual worlds. That's the essence of man. There is no such thing as a human being that cannot do that. At least that was the original intention. But by the time the revelation of the Torah at Sinai, the Rebbeinu Shalom decided to create two different species of men because many men did not want this ability, this power. They did grievous sins. They rebelled against God. So what the Rebbeinu Shalom did, he said, I will take away that power of their souls. I will reduce their souls substantially so that they will no longer have this power. They will be mere mortals, meaning that there will be a whole segment of mankind called the Goyim that will never again have this power collectively. Only the Jews retained the power of Adam Rishon because of the schus, because of the incredible worthiness, the merit of the forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the incredible servitude that they did. They retained the power of Zichor, or the power to create an Olam Haba. The Goyim lost that power. So that at Har Sinai, at the revelation of Sinai, the Goyim were created. What is a Goy? A Goy is a human being. A Nochri. Another way to say it in Hebrew is either Nochri, which means stranger, or Goy, which means nation. It refers to all of mankind except the Jews. And what it refers to is a human being who has lost the capacity by virtue of his soul to transform Olam Hazeh into Olam Haba. He does not have the power. What power does he have? He has the power to absorb the Kedusha which exists in Olam Hazeh. That's the essence of a God. What the Rebbeinu Shalom said to him was, since you have rejected my offers and you have rejected a relationship with me, I will still allow you to exist. I will let you survive, but I will let you survive here and now, and I will allow you to absorb the goodness and the Kedusha, the holiness, which exists in the mask called Olam Hazeh. Only. It is a very, very reduced power. Only the Jews have the ability to obtain and to procure the power of Kedusha and Hana, of Simcha, which lies in Olam Haba. The Goyim no longer have that ability. They have that ability simply in this world, and that is their toll. But what the Rebbeinu Shalom said, in order for the Goyim to have that, they still have to keep mitzvahs, because the Rebbeinu Shalom never gives anything to anybody for nothing, not to a human being. Because the human being is a reflection of God in the sense that he's like the Rebbeinu Shalom with the sense of self. The Rebbeinu Shalom therefore always demands of a person effort and choice, because that's what the human being wants. A human being, an Adam, wants to be able to deserve something by virtue of his efforts. Because like God, just as God is a creator, he is a producer, man also has that aspect in his nature. He wants to produce, he wants to create. So the Rebbeinu Shalom says, I will allow you to create your own simcha. by developing a certain relationship with me. So to the Jews he said, you will be able to create Olam Haba if you observe 613 mitzvahs. To the Goy he said, you will be able to live in Olam Hazeh and enjoy it to the fullest capacity if you observe the 7 mitzvahs. The 7 mitzvahs which I have handed down from Adam to Noah and have been passed down to mankind, to you. If you observe these 7 mitzvahs, and I gave an enumeration last time, a number of them, the 7 mitzvahs have to do with setting up the course of law, establishing governments, and administration of justice, to believe in God, not to curse Him, not to commit adultery, and not to commit theft and homicide, and a number of others, also not to eat from a portion from a living animal, even min achai. But these are basically the 7 mitzvahs. These 7 mitzvahs keep the goyim civilized. And what the Baruch Shem said, as long as you remain civilized, I will bestow upon you the simcha of Olam Hazeh. But if you lose that civilized aspect, if you begin to reduce yourself to a total chaya, I will destroy you entirely. To the Jew he says, your purpose is not to be a civilized human being, that is the purpose of a goy. Your purpose is to be a malach or an angel, because I have given you a neshama that can ascend into the highest world. So it is not enough for you to be compassionate, to be a good person. It is not enough. You have to be a spiritual man. You have to be a holy person. You see, that's an extra dimension that a Jew was given that a goy was not. It is incumbent upon a Jew to become holy. Kedoshim to you, thou shalt be holy. Because I, the Lord thy God, am holy. A Jew has to practice what's called kedusha, and the essence of kedusha, besides the fact that a Jew has to be moral and kind and compassionate from one person to another, he also has to be holy. What is the essence of kedusha or holiness? The essence of kedusha or holiness is a withdrawal from physical and material preoccupations. That's what kedusha is. Holiness is established by setting limits on the preoccupation with the physical life. Why is it established that? Because a person has a neshama. And as long as a person has a neshama, that neshama which is tied to a guf or to a body cannot exercise its fullest kedusha. When the person withdraws to some extent from the physical life, automatically he sensitizes or enhances himself to the spiritual life. And that's the kedusha that God wants. God wants a Jew to be holy, to be kaddish, to sanctify himself by concentrating on his involvement with higher things, on his involvement with God. To the goy he says, you will be sanctified if you simply preoccupy yourself with physical things, but you are kind to each other and you do not transgress on the abominable things in which you're all capable of doing, like the homicides, wars, and constant destruction which we've seen in human history. That's the essence. So, there's Yisrael, the Jew, right, with certain what's called kochas hanefesh, certain inner spiritual power of his neshama. The Jew has a certain kind of neshama. That neshama, as we've said, entitles him, empowers him with certain kinds of responsibilities and certain types of opportunities. Then there's all the other goyim. As we said last time, all the secular goyim, all the nations of the world have been divided into 70 different classes or categories. This is very important to understand. When the Baruch Shem separated mankind into 2 species, the Jew and the goy, he subdivided the goyim into 70 different species. Because there's no such thing as a goy. There is no such thing as a goy. It's goy number 25, goy number 63. It sounds funny. But the point is that there are 70 different subspecies of goyim. This is what's critical. There are subspecies of goyim. Each subspecies of goy is different from the other one. It's vastly different. If we have a scale here of all the goyim, going from 70, let's say this is 35, let's say this is 3, 2, 1, and let's say 70 is the highest level of a goy. The goy at number 70 is right below a Jew. It means he missed out being with the capacity to build an Olam Haba, and he's one down. He's the one quantitably below a Jew. He is. The goy number 1 and 2 are abominable, meaning that because of the chatoim, because of the transgressions that are done in the time of Noah, and at the time of the generation of the Tower of Babel, and at the time of Avon, there were goyim that created species of men that literally have very terrible dispositions. By nature, they're almost evil. Then the goyim at the bottom categories means the grouping, the species of goyim, the nations that are at the bottom, according to this numerical system, are people who have neshamas that are so low. You see, that it's very little to distinguish them between Balei Chayim or between animals, except the fact that they have states of consciousness and selves. So there are many different levels of goyim. We cannot confuse them. That's very important. There are 70 levels. All of these 70 levels all have one thing in common. None of them have the ability to get to Olam Haba by themselves. Any one of these people can get to Olam Haba if he converts and he becomes Jewish, which means that any one of these ones can then go up into the class called Yisrael as an individual, but collectively, as a nation, none of them can ever move. I won't go into the reasons for that. That has to do with the Shorish and the Onaf. We went into this before. All 70 of these share that fact that none of them can create Olam Haba themselves. But there is another option. If these goyim are very elach, they're very civilized and they're very honest and very good, it is possible for a goy in any one of these categories to reside in Olam Haba once it's built by the Jews. Once the Jews collectively have constructed an Olam Haba, it is possible for any goy through exemplary behavior to also partake in a portion of it. Once the meal has been cooked, a goy can eat as well, but it can have nothing to do with the preparation of the dinner. The essential place of a goy is here and now. You know, it's a funny thing. Christmas just passed by and so on, and the question was asked, what is the Jewish view of Christmas and so on, and the fact that the goyim are out there celebrating and so on? What's the sense of the Jewish view? Well, generally, if you speak to a lot of people, they'll say, well, Christmas is a goyish holiday. It is an avodah zarah. It is a shtus. It is a stupid thing, and it's absolutely absurd. And so on and so forth. But the truth of the matter is there's a deeper truth in that. Because Christmas, or that religion in this particular case, is the goyim, and the fact that the goyim concentrate at Christmas time in terms of good deeds and in terms of compassion and so on, brings God great simcha. Because this is what He wants of them. You see. The fact that suddenly they're all ennobled to do good deeds, even if it's one time of the year, is something which is very important to the Shemayim. You see. Don't underestimate it. In a very strange way, even though the entire holiday itself is false, in terms of the entire view of Jesus and who He was and what He was, it's an absolute falsity, you see. But nevertheless, this is the chelik that was given to the goyim. This is their portion. And as long as the goyim maintain a very powerful morality and a compassion and a love between themselves, then God is satisfied as far as the goyim are concerned. It's a strange way to look at it. But there's a very strong emes to that. Therefore, each of these two categories or species of men called Jew and called Goy, with the Goy having been divided into 70 of these categories and the Jew having no subdivisions at all, and we spoke about this, there is no such thing as different species of Jews. It does not exist. There is only one individual called Jew, whether he's a Cohen or Levi or Yisrael, whether he's from the tribe of Shimon or the tribe of Yosef or the tribe of Ephraim or Manasseh, or Levi, it's irrelevant. It doesn't matter what it is. Whether he's a Baal Tshuva, whether he's from, whether his father is an Ashkenaz. There is only one thing called a Jew. There is no distinction in the eyes of God between any Jew, one way or the other. There is only distinction if a Jew is a tzaddik or if he's not. If he's righteous and he's not. That is the only distinction that God draws. His deeds. God is his origin, his culture, where he comes from is absolutely irrelevant to the fact that he's Jewish and to his ability to create Olam Haba. In fact, that irrelevance is seen so great that it says in Pirkei Avos that a mamzer, an illegitimate child who is born from adultery, from the issue of adultery, who has a certain halacha called mamzer, you see. And a mamzer is a person who's Jewish, the mother was Jewish and the father Jewish, but the mother was a married woman, and the child is a result of an illicit adulterous affair where the wife was a mother, was a married woman at the time. This child cannot marry another Jew. He cannot marry another Jew. because of the fact that he was such an issue. But as far as Olam Haba goes, there is really no difference. Meaning that it says that a Mamza, who's a Talmud Chacham, is greater than a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, who's an Amoris. So there you have it. He's greater than the high priest. If the Mamza knows more than the high priest, he has a greater merit in that way. You see. So again, that pinpoints and that accentuates the concept that all Jews are beloved by God equally, without any difference. And if we Jews make that difference, it is called sinas chinam. It is called enmity. Enmity for no reason at all, and unfortunately Jews are very, very skilled at that. And what that does is totally block the possibility of redemption. That is why the Jews are on this Golus in exile for the last 2,000 years. Because they can't, somewhere they can't get it together and begin to think of themselves as one people. That is the fundamental reason why God says, you can't get it together, you don't want to see yourself as one people, then I'll follow suit. I'll distribute you among the nations of the world. The neshama of a Jew has certain capacities of the neshama called kochas ha-nefesh, the abilities of the soul. That's the essence of a Jew. A goy has his kochas ha-nefesh. As we've said, the kochas ha-nefesh of a Jew is the ability to construct an olam haba. The kochas ha-nefesh of a goy does not have that. He only has the ability to in some way access the simcha from this world. Now, depending on the kind of neshama that you have, that will lead to certain type of traits, ethnic traits. The Jew will have certain types of traits that will result just from his mere fact that he's Jewish, that his mother was a Jew. He will have a certain concept of morality or justice, certain compassion. He will have a certain strong desire for knowledge, a very strong spiritual sensitivity. In other words, the fact that the neshama of a Jew is high means that automatically the Jewish people will experience, in terms of national traits, certain types of what? Of characteristics, which Goyim will not. Automatically. This is the way it should be. There are certain exceptions to this rule, but let's leave the exceptions go. Goyim will experience all these different characteristics depending on which level of the neshama they're at. If Goy number 70, who is a very high Goy, at the very high Goy, will be a Goyish nation, a Goyish nation, right? That is very high in their concept of justice. They're very disturbed when injustice takes place. They're generally compassionate and they practice a great deal of charity. They are very much into learning and into knowledge, into understanding what the world is all about. You see, and they have a certain level of spiritual sensitivity. That is a trait of a very high goy. The trait of a very low goy is exactly the opposite. You will find goyim in the world who are essentially cruel by nature. All they want to do is participate in war. They have nothing better to do than constantly conquer other peoples. They are incredible egoists, very arrogant, extremely materialistic. They shy away from all types of learning, and they're always into power and to those things that will make them great. There are nations in the world which you can see. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you observe carefully, you can see something called a national personality. If you observe carefully, the national personality, it comes from the level of where that guy came from, or where that nation is from. These are the origins. The kind of neshama that the guy has by the time Matan Torah arrives will, in many senses, tell you, or it will, in senses, it will generate what kind of national personality he has. Now, when I mean a national personality, I mean the average personality of all the goyim in that one nation. There will be variations in the goyim themselves, but fundamentally there is a certain concept called a national personality. Because of the Kedusha of Yisrael, the national personality of a Jew should be extremely exalted. Should be. It was. Because of the nature of the goyim, the fact that there are 70 different types, they will exhibit 70 different types of national personalities. The national personalities of each one of these Yisrael and Goyim will produce certain type of cultures, so that the social institutions, the legal institutions, the rituals they have, political, commercial enterprises, which essentially define the culture, will also reflect the national personality which comes from the Kochas HaNefesh. There is no accident why each different nation has different cultures. The culture of a specific nation is an outgrowth of the certain type of Kochas HaNefesh that nation has collectively. And that, of course, comes from where they fit in the scale at Matan Torah. So we see an amazing thing. We see that fundamentally it is the internal panemius of a person, type of neshama that he has, where he comes from, at the outset of civilization, that will essentially determine the kinds of national personalities we see and the types of cultures which those national personalities will reflect. Do we see how it moves? Finally, the level of hatzlacha, or prosperity, that each nation will experience depends on its ultimate kochos hanefesh. Now this has to be understood a little deeper, and this is what I want to go into tonight. The Jew. What kind of prosperity should the Jew experience? Well, as I said before, the Jew has a certain capacity and a certain demand placed on him. The obligation on the Jew is to build himself into a holy person. Therefore, when God wants to reward the Jews, the key reward for a Jew is not in this world, because that's his very power. The very power of a Jew is to create another time, another place, which will exist forever. It's to create a place where the person can access simcha, joy, and pleasure without hindrance and without barriers. It is impossible for you people to understand what the level of that is, you see. But as much as you think that you're having a great time when you're experiencing the greatest pleasures of your body, that is an infinitesimal to what is really capable of it being experienced when your body and the neshama are joined as one in a spiritual plane. Because as I've said before, and I cannot amplify it, all pleasure comes from kedusha. Pleasure, simcha, anything which is good comes from the power of kedusha, and the power of kedusha comes from the Ribono Shel Olam. It is not possible to have any kind of pleasure, any kind, the slightest nuance, if in some way you haven't plugged in to the Ribono Shel Olam. But there are different types of pleasures. There are pleasures which have barriers over them, masks, and those which do not. When the Ribono Shel Olam placed the neshama into the body became a barrier, so that the person who is the union of neshama and guf can now experience pleasure in a inhibited fashion. But if there was no such barrier, if that guf was unified with that neshama in a spiritual way, then the two together can experience that pleasure, whatever pleasure is involved, in an incredible way. All of us today, all of us who live as people, experience our pleasures and our simchas and our joys through the body. And I want you to imagine the greatest form of simcha that you can have. That is an infinitesimal to what you will have when that body no longer is a barrier. So therefore, whether you experience the pleasure of Olam Hazeh or the pleasure of Olam Haba, there's really no difference. When the Mashiach arrives, the cardiac facilities in most hospitals will be filled, because there will be people left and right dying of heart attacks. And the reason why they'll be dying of heart attacks, because they will have hit on the one most profoundest truth that no one ever realized before. People thought, you see, that when they ran after all the preoccupations and all the pleasures of the body, they thought this had nothing to do with God. They thought in some way, by building themselves up and creating themselves as an individualist, in some way they will be able to get rid of God and become individualists. That's what most people think. I do my own thing, I enjoy myself, as if the pleasures that I have are mine. You see, people think when they run after sins, when they eat things which are not kosher, or they do all kinds of things which are not allowable, they think that the pleasure that they're getting is something that they are deriving on their own and it has nothing to do with God. But what they don't understand is that there's no such thing as pleasure without God, even in sin. Except that the difference is that the Ribono Shel Olam allowed pleasure to exist in sin and out of sin. The difference is an enormous difference in magnitude. This is the incredible thing, is enormous difference in magnitude. When the Mashiach comes and this distinction is no longer seen, people will realize that they ran after pleasure, and that pleasure really had two different origins. It had two different sources. That pleasure was possible to the neshama directly, because the neshama then could directly plug into the Ribono Shel Olam, or that pleasure was allowable through the guf, where the Ribono Shel Olam says, I don't want you to concentrate. I don't want you to concentrate on plugging into me and experiencing that simcha with barriers. I want you to plug into me and experience the incredible simcha without barriers. So when I tell you that when you run after the body and you run after the guf and everything, essentially what you're doing is you're experiencing these simchas in an inferior level. And when you experience it on an inferior level, this will become your chilek. You don't realize it, that you're giving up the real level of it. So when the Mashiach arrived, all the people who devoted their entire life to material gain, to power, to what? To recognition, to pleasures and to material goods and so on, will realize that these are the exact same things they're going to experience in Olam Haba. Exactly. Except in Olam Haba, it'll be transformed into a totally spiritual thing, and will be infinitely greater. And they'll say to themselves, what did I do? What did I do? I thought I was getting something different. I'm getting the same thing on a much more inferior level. So what did I give up? That will be the most devastating relationship when the Mashiach appears. You see, that they ran after the same thing, that when they ran after the pleasures of the body, they were really running after the pleasures of Olam Haba, except on an incredibly inferior status. Now that's extremely disturbing. The point is, what is success for a Jew? The essence of a Jew lies in the fact that his simcha is Olam Haba. That's where it's at. Therefore, the most important hatzlacha that's given to the Jews is spiritual. What's the hatzlacha that's given to the Jews that's spiritual? The most important thing of all. An incredible awareness of the existence and presence of God. Not only in terms of his neshama, but also in terms of insight, in terms of knowledge, and in terms of feeling. When the Jew rises to the level where he understands the world, when he understands the way of God in the world, and he understands what's called Yichud HaBoreh, what's understands the unity of God, when he understands how the power and will of God is manifested in every specific thing in the world, and when he goes his life in raising his neshama to develop a certain loving relationship with the Rebbeinu Shalom, that simcha is the real simcha that the Rebbeinu Shalom wants the Jew to have. As I said before, the essence of a tzaddik is not in an individual who keeps tayag mitzvahs. If you say to a person, what is a tzaddik? What is the highest level that a Jew can reach? So that another person will say, look, if the person keeps the 613 mitzvahs with exactitude, that is an inferior definition of a tzaddik. The real definition of a tzaddik is that a tzaddik is a Jew who has a very unique perception of who God is. And the 613 mitzvahs that he keeps are nothing more than an expression of that particular relationship that he has of that awareness. The difference between a tzaddik and a rasha is what he thinks of God. That's it. That's really what it is, and how he experiences God. Very great tzaddikim on the highest level literally have related to the Rebbeinu Shalom in such a powerful way that they actually can perceive him through their neshama, meaning that they can feel his presence, just as you see my presence here. They cannot see God, but the awareness of who he is, the awareness of his presence, is clearly before them. It's not an intellectual effort. They don't think about God, they can feel it. Literally as a perception. That's what a true tzaddik is, and that's what a Jew is supposed to become. The Yisrael, he's supposed to achieve what's called spiritual success. He's supposed to go up to the level of the highest levels of knowledge, so that he's familiar not only what goes on down here, but what goes on up there. He's familiar with all the different powers and processes and mechanisms which exist in the entire spiritual realm as well. He achieves the level of prophecy, which every Jew should have by right. I don't know if you all know that. All of you should have been prophets. And all of you will be prophets as soon as the Mashiach arrives. The smallest among you will be prophets. You will instantly know the future and know many, many things that are not knowable through conceptual inference. Prophecy is the gift. Prophecy is yours by right. The neshama of every person in this room has the right to become a prophet. Sounds strange, doesn't it? Why don't you have it? Because you've given it up. You've abdicated it. That's why. You've relinquished it, essentially. This is the punishment is taken away from you. But spiritual success means that you have the ability to prophesy. Not like Moshe Rabbeinu, but you have the ability to prophesy and develop an incredible connection with the spiritual beings on high. Now, you're also entitled to material success as well. You're entitled to material success also to enhance the station of where you exist in life. But the prominent success is spiritual. That's what should be accrued to a Jew. What about a goy? What is a goy entitled to? As you have said, there are 70 levels of goyim. So each goyish nation is entitled to its particular level. The goy who's at level number 1, who is almost incredibly obscene, in terms of the level of the neshama, is entitled, because of the neshama, to a very low degree of hatzlacha, a very low degree. Because of the fact that his performance of the 7 mitzvahs are so inferior, the amount of prosperity that he experiences is very minimal. The ones that are on very high, like number 70, experience the greatest degree of material success. But the essence of a goy is the experience of material success. You see, you have to remember this. The Buddhism wants the goy to experience material success. You see, we as Jews look out and we see these goyim having all this good time. And we say it's not fair. You see, it's not fair that they're having such a great time, that they really have no restrictions on them, that they can do almost whatever they want within reason. And that reason is called the 7 mitzvahs. But it's not fair. But what we forget is the fact that the Buddhism is saying to you, you are supposed to capture eternity. They simply capture what they have now, and that's it. When the show is over, and that's the end of it. But what the Buddhism says is that I want them to experience the simcha. The neshama of a goy is built to experience the simcha which resides in Olam Hazeh. That's what it is. And the Buddhism therefore is masameach. Yes, the Buddhism is happy when the goyim are masameach, or participate in the joy in which they're capable of. Because you have to remember, if the Buddhism had not wanted the goyim at all to exist, he would have destroyed them at Matan Torah. The fact is, what the Buddhism said was, you no longer could be in Olam Haba directly, only indirectly, but at least I will give you Olam Hazeh. I will let you experience this, you see. And therefore they have the right to go out and to experience that. And when they perform the 7 mitzvahs in an exemplary fashion, the Buddhism gives them incredible hatzlacha in Olam Hazeh. They become very, very wealthy, or they become very, very materially prosperous. Does that mean that a goy has nothing to do with spirituality? Also not. What the Buddhism said is that if you conduct yourselves in a very proper way to the goyim, I will give you spiritual success. But what's the spiritual success of a goy? What is the spiritual success of a goy? The spiritual success of a goy is an awareness also of who the Buddhism is, and also some attempt to connect himself to a higher plane. But there are other types of spiritual successes that a goy can have, which Jews essentially could have, but are not our portion. And what are those? Many of the spiritual successes which you see in the East, like the practices of what we call it of yoga, many of these practices and so on, which allow these nations to obtain a certain level of consciousness, a higher level of consciousness above the guf, is what a goy is entitled to. The religions of the East, specifically Hinduism, Buddhism and so on, attempt to achieve certain states of super consciousness. What is a state of super consciousness? Essentially what it is, it's a level of awareness of the sense of self or I, which is beyond the body, you see. Now if it's beyond the body, doesn't that look like they're going to the world of neshama? No, because there are interim stages. You see, the sense of I that I have while I'm in my body is totally different than the sense of self that a neshama may possess when it's out. But there's an interim stage where a person can be inside of a body and yet in certain ways escape the physical bind or the physical trapping on the sense of consciousness, you see. And in the East, they are capable of reaching these stages. Essentially, one of those stages, what I believe is very true, is a stage called samadhi, which is achieved also, but it's a state of such super consciousness where a person suddenly becomes cognizant of the very essences of existence itself and leaves behind just the physical perception of itself. I can't go into that. There's a whole shiur devoted to this alone, and that's in the future. And we will go into the essence of yoga and to Buddhism and to these religions and discuss the nature of spiritualism which exists. But the spiritualism which exists in these religions are absolutely permissible to goyim. What is not permissible are the religions themselves. What is unfortunate is that they've taken these spiritual abilities or these techniques to develop higher levels of consciousness and have combined them with false deities. That's what they've done. And this, of course, is not permissible. This is avodah zarah. This is idolatry. But the fact that the goyim are allowed to experience higher levels of consciousness, or what's called the consciousness of the nefesh ta'atena, you see, is permissible to a goy. That's his ruchnius. What happens if the Jews do not observe the Tayag mitzvahs? What happens? We are talking in the case of the Jews observing all the Taryag mitzvahs. And we're saying in that case there is spiritual satisfactions, there is great reward, there is Olam Haba, there are material satisfactions in Olam Hazeh, you see. But what happens if the Jew says we don't want to keep the Taryag mitzvahs, you see. Or we want to have contempt for each other. We want to do all kinds of things. We want to participate in violence and in theft and so on, and Lashon Hara, and all the things that we've been known to do. We do not want to observe the Shabbat or whatever have you, or kasha to all these things. Then what the Baruch Hashem introduces the notion of suffering. Suddenly the entire nation of Israel finds itself in a very unique position. And that position is called suffering. There are many levels of suffering, but the suffering that we know for the last 2,000 years is called Golus, or exile. Now the definition of Golus is not only a physical displacement, where the Jews are taken out of the land of Israel and placed into, what? Alien lands. That is not the real essence of a Golus. That is the minimal and least aspect of a Golus. The essence of exile means, what is exile? To be exiled means that you are not in the place where you belong. That's what it means. You're not in the place where you belong. Now that can refer to the fact physically as well. But there are other possibilities much more painful. You see, if you take a person who has incredible music ability, a Mozart, and you force him to enter school of cooking, and you make him to be a cook, what kind of suffering is that? That is an intense inner suffering. You see, Mozart can be left in Vienna where he lives or whatever have you, but he's forced to become a cook. Now this is the essence. This is the suffering of Golus for the Jew. The suffering of Golus for the Jew is that the Jew should have experienced certain types of cultural aspects and certain types of successes spiritually. When the Jew is sent among the Goyim, when he's forced to live in the Goyim, his ability to experience his culture, his Kedusha, that which he could have gotten, those abilities to literally look into the heavens, the window to heaven, which existed in the Beit HaMikdash, and the window into heaven which exists through the Torah, is confiscated from him. So because of that, his neshama, even though as powerful as it is imprisoned and placed in a dark place. So that when the neshama of a Jew must reside among the neshama of Goyim, it cannot be what it should be. It experiences the inner darkness of a Goy. In other words, the Jew will experience the exact same, cultural aspects and the success of the Goy, but not of the Jew. That is an enormous pain. Because the neshama of a Jew demands something far beyond than the nefesh of a Goy. It demands a simcha. It demands an awareness of spirituality, which is what? Which is essentially true of its neshama. And when that neshama is placed into what? Into a Goyish nation, the Jew is not entitled and no longer is capable of reaching the greatest levels of spiritual success. Now, there's a very big problem here. You may all say, well, we don't feel this anymore. That's because you have all reached the bottom of the barrel. This is the last Golus. And this is the last piece of the last Golus. That's why the darkness is so great. Is that you are no longer even cognizant of your loss. You have no idea what you've lost. And I have said this many times. If I can transport you in a time machine back to the Beit HaMikdash, even the second one, much less the first, and you can experience one regel, one yontef, a sukkah at that time, and then I took you back and put you here, you would never again come out of the wards of a hospital. You would be so depressed, you would live on antidepressants the rest of your life. Why? Because you will have shown what you have lost. You do not know what you have lost. And that's the essence of this Golus. That the culture, the ruchnius, the true spiritual capacity of a Jew has been confiscated and taken away from him. So he cannot have it anymore. That's the notion of real Golus. His neshama is where it doesn't belong. Not only his Golus. The neshama is exiled. Not only the body. If the Jew doesn't observe this Torah, he then experiences great suffering. There are many different types of suffering which the Jew experiences. We have said that the last suffering is called Golus. It is the suffering that we've experienced for the last 2,000 years. It is that suffering. The one who experiences this suffering greatest is the Mashiach himself. Why? Because the Mashiach is an individual who has a neshama that's able to see the light of truth that even Adam didn't possess. And he's got to live in this time. Now, you begin to imagine the kind of suffering he has. He knows, he senses what an Adam knew, what a Moshe Rabbeinu knew, and he lives in 1987. That is the greatest suffering of all. That is the greatest distance between a neshama and an existence known to men. The dichotomy, the tension which exists in the Mashiach is the most powerful tension that can exist in a human being. Why does he suffer that way? That we will discuss later on. But it is because of the fact that he suffers that way that allows the Jews to survive. We give a whole share on why tzaddikim suffer. And he is the suffering tzaddik par excellence. What about a goyim? What happens if goyim don't keep the 7 mitzvahs? If goyim don't keep the 7 mitzvahs, they're in for big trouble. Very, very big trouble. Why is that? Because it's something which we will discuss to a much deeper degree. The suffering of goy is totally different than the suffering of a Jew. It's totally different. Why is it totally different? Because this was the promise that was given to Avraham. This is the promise that was given to Avraham. What was that promise? Very basically, we'll go into it more in depth later on, but when Avraham by the Bris Ben Absalom, when God made a covenant with Avraham, the Baruch Shem said to him basically that I guarantee you that your children will see Olam Haba. Meaning, I guarantee you that your children will go into Eretz Yisrael, and that Eretz Yisrael will become an Olam Haba. So Avraham said to him, what do you mean? How can you guarantee such a thing? How do I know this? So for that, essentially, it was said to Avraham that in some way Avraham was considered to have exhibited a low degree of belief. But what was Avraham's question? What did Avraham really ask God? He said to God, how can you guarantee me that? What do you mean, how can you make such a guarantee? So the Baruch Shem then told him, I will then take your children and put them in the land of Egypt for 410 years. And then I will take them out with great wealth and great prosperity. That's essentially the conversation that happened between the Baruch Shem and Avraham. But basically, when we look at the conversation, we say to ourselves, what did Avraham say to the Baruch Shem? And the truth of the matter is, Avraham was 100% right. He really was. Because he said to him, wait, what's going on over here? How can you give me this kind of guarantee? What are you telling me? You're telling me that what? That me, my children, or that my children will have Olam Haba? You can't make such a guarantee. Why not? Because what about all the people in the world that lived at the same time as me? Where are they? Are they going to Olam Haba? No. In other words, you're telling me here, you're saying to me, Avraham, I'm going to split mankind into 2 different species. I'm going to make a species called Jew and a species called Goy. Why am I going to make a species called Goy? Because these people don't want to listen to what I say, and they don't deserve Olam Haba. But since you are listening to me, you will have Olam Haba. Well, what happens if my children do sins? Why are we better than the Goyim? Why can't we lose the possibility of Olam Haba as well? There's something called Mishpat, or justice. If all the other people of the world lost the capacity to create an Olam Haba because of the fact that they were evil and wicked, why should my children be any better? That's what Avraham said to him. How can you guarantee me? If you have created the world based on justice, just as justice has what? Has removed all the rest of mankind from Olam Haba, why am I better? Why am I exempt from the principles of justice? Very powerful question. Because Avraham said to Baruch Shem, the very fact that you're coming to me is an indication that you cannot make such a guarantee. The very fact that you're coming to me and you're saying, you will take over, and everyone else has lost out, is the highest indication that such a guarantee is not possible. Because it's like, they lost out, maybe my children will lose out as well. So what the Buddhism said was a very, very critical thing. No, they won't. Because what I will do is shift my anhogos. I will change their ratio. I have explained to you what the concept of the ratio of anhogos were, and this is very critical. When God first created the world, and He first created the first man called Adam Rishon, He said to Adam Rishon, you can build an Olam Haba if you observe the mitzvah. If you observe the mitzvah I give you, you will create the Olam Haba with your very hands. That's what He said. But I want you to create it. That's the concept of justice or mishpat. You must do it. I will give you Olam Haba as what? As compensation, but not as a gift. Because you will have earned it with what you will have done. Fine. That's the concept of true justice. You will earn what you will have created. When others failed, what happened? He failed. So why should Adam be given a second chance? Because a new hanhaga, or a new attribute entered into the world, rather in active phase, even though it was there potentially, which is called the hanhagas hayichud, or what they say more in the vernacular is rachamim, or mercy. But I have told you that there's no such thing as mercy really. The Bunishim is not really merciful. What the Bunishim is good. The Bunishim is a mative. God wants to bestow goodness, and that goodness is called Olam Haba. And since the will of God is existence itself, that will must be fulfilled. If God wants to build an Olam Haba, if God wants to give a circumstance of toll, it must be. But how can it be if you give a person free will? The answer is, the Bunishim introduces a new type of hanhaga, which sees to it. It's a backup system. So that what the Bunishim says to Adam, you will achieve Olam Haba one way or the other. But it's guaranteed. You will either achieve it with your own efforts, and that's through din, or you will achieve it because I will have to do what I will have to do to bring it. And that's called yichud. If you bring it through din, you will have controlled the ultimate destiny. That's why they say, the Jews can bring the Mashiach by virtue of their own efforts, if they're tzaddikim. And in that case, the Jews will control when the Mashiach comes. But if the Jews fail to bring the Mashiach by their own efforts, then the Bunishim says, I will bring him. But if I have to bring him, it's a whole different process. That process is called yichud. And in that case, I will bring it in its time. What is the essential instrument that the Bunishim uses to what? To guarantee that the ultimate toll transpires? What is the essential instrument, therefore, that we call what? Rachamim, or mercy? It's called hanhagas hayichud. We will explain that mechanism in detail very soon. But that's what it is. That's what he told Avram. He said the following, when I first created man, then the only attribute which controlled the world was my attribute of justice. I demanded that Adam HaRishon, the first man, acquire Olam Haba on his own, through the attribute of justice. He had to claim it by right. Once he failed, then what I did was I allowed him to survive. And I gave that task over to his descendants. But how was I able to do that? Not my attribute of justice. My attribute of justice would have annihilated Adam HaRishon. But my attribute of what? Of yichud. The fact that my Tov must exist, saw to it that Adam HaRishon will continue to live, and that his descendants will continue to live, and they will bring it. But that's already a deviation from justice. Therefore we find there's a new hanhaga that entered the world in an active phase after the sin of Adam HaRishon. Before the sin, only justice existed. After the sin, justice and mercy existed. But now there are two different attributes which govern the events of the world. But if there are two things, there's got to be a ratio. What's the ratio between justice and mercy? The answer is that the ratio of justice and mercy is much greater than justice. At the outset, before Adam sinned, there was what? Justice was what? 100%, and mercy was 0. The actual demonstration of justice was 100%. Because there was no such thing as actual mercy before the Chet of Adam HaRishon. There was no need for it. Once Adam HaRishon did the sin, then the need for mercy became what? Apparent. Hence the attribute of mercy became manifest. But how much did it become manifest? Only to the extent that it was necessary to save Adam HaRishon. And that's it. So the ratio was 95% justice, let's say 5% mercy. But that's all. At the outset, there was only a 5% ratio. Mercy existed only 5%, whereas justice existed 95%. But as mankind continued to sin, then the ratio of these two hanhagas shifted, so that the world became closer and closer to mercy and further away from justice. What does that mean? That means that as men continue to sin, then what the Bunishim says is that I will bring the ultimate redemption through me and through my principles, not through your efforts. And what the Bunishim says, I will allow 6,000 years for that process to take place. At the outset, I hope that you will be able to bring the ultimate redemption and the ultimate Olam Haba totally through justice. But if you don't, then we will begin to use mercy and we'll begin to temper the ratios. But if this world goes on to the year 6,000 or close to it, it means that as we get near the year 6,000, what will be the ratios? If God had to drag this world out for 5,000 years, how much justice is there really left? Not much. You see, in other words, that the attributes which God dominates the world today, which He controls the world, had very little to do with justice. That's why this world looks like an insanity. Because it's controlled by the Hanagas HaYichud. The Hanagas HaYichud attempts to bring the ultimate redemption, you see, through a totally different kind of process than the Hanagas HaMishpach. But the ratio is constantly shifting. By the time the Mashiach arrives, which is close to the last point, the ratios will be extraordinary, incredibly extraordinary. You see, if you all look outside and you say, why is it that so many Jews are not religious? You see, let's understand this. In America today, right, 91% of Jews are not religious at all. Only 10% or 9%. Only 9% of Jews in America are observant. Okay, 90% of Jews are not religious. What does that mean? Why has such a thing happened? Why has God allowed such a nation to be in this way, you see? Whereas at the outset by Matan Torah, everybody was religious. How is it that Klal Yisrael descended to such a great low madrega? Is it because it's so hard to keep the Torah? No, of course not. The point is that most people who are not religious have no idea what religion is. They're all born under circumstances where they're not familiar with religion. It's called a Tinish Nishba. It's an individual who never had the opportunity to even know what religion or Judaism is. Why has God allowed this circumstance to be? The answer is the Hanagas HaYichud. That's what it is. Because in a world which is controlled by justice, means a world where men have full responsibility for their actions. God allows men to have full responsibility for their actions, and therefore gives them a complete opportunity to build Olam Haba. But as man sins more and more, the Baruch begins to confiscate the opportunity, and begins to confiscate the responsibility. So what happens is the Jews find themselves in less and less of a position to do the 613 commandments, because it's been taken away from them. By the time the Mashiach arrives, the amount of Jews who are left that actually are from will be extremely minimal. What about the rest? It doesn't mean that the rest of Jews, chas v'sholom, are destroyed or that God doesn't concern about them. It simply means that these individuals somehow have lost an enormous amount of their opportunity to build an Olam Haba to the extent that they could have. So what the Baruch now wants to see is that they can build the smallest pieces of Olam Haba. That's all that's left. That's it. That's the amount of justice which governs them. Very little. When a tzaddik goes to shul on Yom Kippur, and he's a real tzaddik and he knows a great deal of learning and he does sins, then the Ben Shemala goes crazy. What do it mean? It means the Ben Shemala on Yom Adin and Rosh Hashanah is extremely furious at a tzaddik who's done what? Who's done many chatoim. Because he should have known better. But when a Baal Tshuva goes to shul on Rosh Hashanah, it's a whole different situation. All the Malachim, everyone sits back and relaxes. Why? Because the point is that they are very happy specifically with the level that he has brought at this point in time. The heavens judge different Jews totally differently. Why? Because fundamentally the way they will judge a Jew is directly related to the amount of opportunity that they would have allowed this Jew to have in the first place. That's where we're really at. So you may say, well, wait a minute, if that's the case, why should I make a person from? Because we can't keep that cheshbon. As far as we are concerned, we have to bring as many Jews back to the fold. We have to inform as many Jews as possible of what is the real truth. We can only be concerned with justice. We are not allowed to deal with the concept of yichud. That is not our measure. That is God's measure. We have to be concerned with what? Full responsibility, full opportunity. And we have to function in that way. But how successful we will become depends on how much God will allow us to be successful. That has to do with his yichud. So basically what the Baruch was saying to Avraham is the following. That at this point in time, the level of mishpat and the level of yichud now exists in a certain ratio. Before I have made this promise to you, the world is ruled by much more justice and by much less mercy. You see, that's why you, Avraham, have the right to say to me, well, how do I know that my children will definitely acquire Olam Haba? You have the right. Because you're thinking in terms of the ratio that existed before your time. 2, the ratio of justice to mercy was different. Justice was much greater than the mercy hanhagas, or the way I guided the world. But now that I've made you, I promise you, Avraham, that I further will alter the ratio, so that there never again will be an attribute of justice. There never again will be a claim of justice that will allow your children to be removed from the possibility of Olam Haba. Never again. Just as I promised Noah never to destroy the human race physically, I promise you that I will never again destroy the human race spiritually. I will guarantee that there will be a remnant who will be in Olam Haba. That was the promise to Avraham. An incredibly powerful promise. And how did he promise that? Has to do with the whole Indian of Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt, which we will go into at a different point in time. But do we understand what the guarantee is? The guarantee to the Jew is that the Jew will survive. That is the guarantee to Avraham. I say to you that the Jew will survive, the Baruch Hashem says, and the Jew will inhabit Olam Haba. I will never again do to the Jew what I have done to the Goyim. I will never again confiscate from an individual the ability to create an Olam Haba. And your children will retain that ability to the end of time. Because I will change the ratio of Mishpat to Yichud. You see. Therefore, the suffering of a Goy is totally different than the suffering of a Jew. Because the suffering of a Jew comes from the Yichud, or the Hanugas HaYichud. But the suffering of a Goy comes from the Hanugas HaMishpat. That's the difference. A Goy, the Baruch Hashem says to a Goy, you have Olam Haba. You have Olam Hazeh. That's what he said to a Goy. But I will only give you Olam Hazeh if you keep the 7 mitzvahs. If you fail to keep the 7 mitzvahs, you will have nothing. And I will what? I will therefore demonstrate the full attribute of justice on you. So what happens is the justice comes down on Goyim and eradicates them. Literally. But when the Jew backslides, God remembers the promise of Avraham and the ratio of the Yichud to Mishpat, and he says, I guarantee you, so I will cause you suffering, but that suffering will simply restore you back to your pristine state. When the Jew suffers, he suffers to go back to where he was before. When the Jew suffers in exile, it's to return to his original homeland, both physically and spiritually. When the Goy suffers, it's because justice demands and exacts its payment. It is a different thing. So you could never compare the suffering of a Jew to the suffering of a Goy. Why does the Goy have to suffer? Why? We can't begin to understand what the situation is in the nations of the Goyim. For example, where do you see this? Well, if you'll notice, if you look at the areas of the world, you'll see some interesting things. Which parts of the world suffer most? Asia, Africa. If you'll ever notice, they suffer terribly in their poverty. I mean, the poverty is incredible. But if you look at the American continent, if you look at Canada, America, England, Western Europe, even pieces of Eastern Europe, if you look at these sections of the world, you'll see that they have the highest levels of material prosperity. Now, why is it? Why is it that the Goyim who live in these areas, these regions, somehow have attained a much higher level of prosperity than the Goyim who lives in other parts of the world? Well, it's difficult to have a specific answer, but if you look more carefully, you'll see a very interesting thing. That the Goyim who live in Asia and the Goyim who live in Africa, essentially, are Goyim who are steeped in Avodah Zarah. They still have the vestiges of Avodah Zarah. In Asia, you have the incredible worship of Buddha, a man, and in Hinduism, constant worship of deities and idols and polytheism. The same thing with Africa. Therefore, but if you look at Western Europe and the Americas, you'll see the belief in what? Either in one God to the Muslims, or you'll see the belief in the Trinity, which for the Goyim in certain ways is considered allowable, permissible. Because even a Goy, even a Catholic or a Christian acknowledges God to be the creator of the world, and Jesus is only some kind of subordinate, even though they feel that Jesus is the way to heaven. That's something else. But the fact is that the belief in a God who creates the world, God the Father, even a Goy will say God the Father, and a Muslim will say Allah, where there's no problem with that. That kind of Goy has achieved a much higher level, you see. So that kind of Goy will be great, have a greater sense of prosperity. But the Goyim who are steeped in Avodah Zarah, the Goyim therefore who defy the 7 mitzvahs, will experience much worse levels of suffering. So therefore it is not coincidental that in the Occident, rather in the Orient, you find the vast suffering of mankind. In the East, whereas in the West, you find generally that mankind is much more prosperous. Because it all has to do with how the Goy keeps the 7 mitzvahs. What a Goy doesn't understand, really, he thinks he can go and he thinks he can do what he wants to do. Goyim think that they can do war, they can kill and do all kinds of cruel acts and not suffer. But the truth is that these goyim are brought back constantly. They're reincarnated. They're reincarnated and constantly destroyed. Because when you do a sin, when a goy does a sin, what he does is he forces Kedusha to disappear. So what God says, that Kedusha must be retrieved. The goy who kills another person, the goy who is cruel to each other, must come back and suffer that same fate. You see, where is this justice? We cannot see the way God dispenses justice to the goyim, but it's different than the way he dispenses to the Jews. When in Poland in the 17th century there was the Chmielnicki pogroms, where 100,000 Jews were killed in Poland, you had the Ukrainians and the Cossacks, who pogrom after pogrom killed how many Jews? It was a strange thing that at the end of World War II, Stalin wiped out 20 million Ukrainians. Now when you look at it, you say, what a dastardly act, what an incredible cruelty from Stalin to kill 20 million Ukrainians. And the truth it is. As far as human beings are concerned, we look at what Stalin did. He and Khrushchev butchered 20 million Ukrainians. We say this is a horrible thing. Or Mao Zedong killed 10, 15, 20 million Chinese to initiate his land reform programs. It's a horrible thing to us. It is, isn't it? That's true. Because we have to look in the sense of fairness, in the sense of justice. But how does God look at it? Who knows how many of these Ukrainians in a different time and a different place were involved in how many pogroms and how many destructions of Jews throughout the centuries? Who knows? But what a guy doesn't understand is that when he goes there and he kills, he will return to be butchered. Because it must be exacted. The law of justice must exact it. God does not stand by and allow these cruelties to exist without there's an exact the wheels of justice grind very slow, but they grind exceedingly fine. So that the need of justice and the law of justice which applies to the goyim are very, very severe. Why is it severe? It is severe because what the Baruch Hashem says to a goy, I beg you, be civilized, be a mensch, don't be a behemoth, you see. And if you do that, I will give you all the material prosperity you want of an olam hazeh. More than that, I will even allow you to go into an olam haba, but be a mensch. And when the goy says, I don't want to be a mensch, I want to do what I want, I want to destroy what I want to eradicate and annihilate and do in all these things that the Baruch Hashem says, you will pay the exact same price. Because the need of justice, the attitude of justice is very severe with goyim. With the Jews, it is not. It is not severe. Why? Because of the promise that God said to Avram. Because of the ratios that existed at that time. That's in essence what it is. Avram, the Baruch Hashem made a promise to Avram that he has kept since that time. That the ratio of justice to mercy will not be overbearing. So that the mercy will be able to function never to annihilate the concept of a Jew. Or the existence of a Jew. That's why no matter how many goyim pile onto a Jew, no matter how many times goyim want to kill Jews, through the thousands of years, no matter how many exiles the Jews have to go through, they will always come out untouched. And every nation who has tried to destroy them has disappeared. Whether it's Egypt, whether it's Assyria, whether it's Babylonia, whether it's Greece, whether it's Rome, whatever it is, these nations no longer exist. None of them. All you see is their monuments, and that's it. But the Jew is still here with the same Torah. But what's the guarantee of that Jew? It's not the guarantee of a Jew. There's nothing spectacular about the person. The guarantee was made to Avram that this kind of individual will survive. The kind of individual who will be able to build Olam Haba through the efforts of his will survive to the end of time. That's what God said, I guarantee it. And I guarantee it because I want to see an Olam Haba, the Baruch Hashem says. I am a native. I bestow goodness. And I want to see that goodness exist at some point in time. And since the Jew essentially has become the main recipient of that goodness, it is the Jew who will survive. Because Olam Haba will survive. Therein lies the enormous power of a Jew. And therein lies the power of his survival. Because it is the power of his message. It is the power of his koyach, of his neshama, that forces his survival and is able to vanquish and destroy every goy who attempts to destroy him. We have discussed, therefore, the nations of the world with regard to the attribute of justice only. We have discussed and we have noticed that there are just two species of men, Yisroel and Goyim, and that these two species are judged in certain ways depending on a certain objective, where the objective of the Jew is Olam Haba and the objective of the Goy is Olam Hazeh. And we have noticed how the various traits and cultures proceed from these particular Kochas HaNefesh. But in essence, this kind of history is not what exists, you see, because the history that comes from the world of justice, from the meat of justice, is a history where there is no interface. In the attribute of justice, the Jews do not interrelate with the Goyim, nor do the Goyim interrelate with themselves. They do not have that. You see, what it is the attribute of justice simply discriminates among all men that exist and says, I see 71 different categories. And then it says, let's take each one of these 71 different categories, place them on a certain place on earth, and let's give him the opportunity to achieve his objectives. But according to this principle, there is no interface. Each one goes and moves on his own. So the question is, then why do the Jews go among Goyim? Or why do the Goyim constantly assimilate among themselves? To answer that, we have to go into the concept of Hanagas HaYichud. How does Hanagas HaYichud deal with the Goyim? You see, we understand what Hanagas HaYichud does for the Jews. It saves them. But what does it do for the Goyim? Is there a Hanagas HaYichud for the Goyim? Interesting question, isn't there? The answer is there is. And we will begin to understand that this Hanagas HaYichud that goes to the Goyim is extremely, extremely important, because it explains everything that happens in human history. I have said, and I will conclude this with the following, I have said that there are essentially two species of men. The answer is that there are really more. There are really four basic species of men. Two that were created at the time of Matan Torah, but there was one subspecies that was created before and one after. And I'd like to just go over these four different species. The first subdivision is between the Jew and the Goy. We have said that the Baruch Hashem has divided man into two species with respect to his ability to create Olam Haba. Not go to Olam Haba, create Olam Haba. Remember, even a Goy can go to Olam Haba if he is exemplary in his 7 mitzvahs. But to create an Olam Haba, he cannot do that unless he converts. We have said that mankind has been divided into two species with respect to that particular property. But the truth about it is the Goy has been divided even further. You see, we have said that the Goy has been divided into 70 different levels, and that is true. But there are two special types of Goyim that Warren mentioned. One is the descendants of Chum, specifically the descendants of Canaan, and the other is Amalek, who are the descendants of Esau. They did something which both of them uniquely differentiated themselves from all of mankind. And as I said before, when God divides men, He divides them by their souls, by their neshamas, not by other physical properties. Therefore, when He divides the men according to the neshamas, they behave differently, they think differently, they have different types of consciousness. First, Chum, one of the sons of Noah, Shem, Chum, and Yafes. Chum and his son Canaan sinned greatly against the Baruch Hashem because of specific things that they did to Noah. And there's a discussion what exactly they did to Noah. Exactly what is involved. I don't want to go into the actual thing, but one discussion was simply there's a possibility that they castrated Noah. That's one view, because of the fact that they felt that they felt that they didn't want any other people to populate the earth. They wanted to control the world, just to have the world divided among the 3 brothers. And therefore they castrated Noah so he would never have any other sons. And that's one possibility. There are a number of different, there's a controversy in exactly what they did. But in essence, what the Baruch Hashem said to Canaan and Chum, He said, He cursed them. God cursed them and said, because you have transgressed in this way, He said that you will become a slave, an eved, to your brothers. Now this is an interesting concept. What does it mean, an eved? It means you will become a slave. It means that throughout human history, you will find yourself in a position of servitude. That's what He said. That was a gzera that God did. Now it happens to be that to a large degree, the children of Chum are blacks. It happens to be there. And in a certain way, the neshama, but it's not only the blacks, there are other peoples as well, you see. that were included in this particular category. Now what you find is that because of this particular situation, the neshama of the sons of Ham would change. How? So that they can exist in servitude. A human being is independent and an individual, and the human being by nature will not submit to a rule or a servitude of a great magnitude. He will allow himself to be governed, but a human being will not allow himself to become a true servant in a slave type of fashion. But in order that the curse of Ham should go on his descendants, the Baruch Hashem altered the neshamas of his descendants through Canaan so that they would allow themselves to become slaves without rebelling. That's a very strange thing. That's an alteration in the neshama itself, so that the human being will simply submit to this particular type of station without rebellion. Now I don't want to go into the details of that, but that's the general concept. Therefore, all the sons of Ham are lower than the Goyim. They're lower in the sense that the descendants of Ham will allow themselves, they lack a certain type of critical neshama factor which will allow themselves to submit to slavery. Therefore, the children of Canaan or Ham are less than the Goyim. That's one significant alteration, and this goes throughout time. Now, that doesn't mean that a person has any kind of justification to put another person in slavery. Don't think I'm saying that for 1 minute. It is an absolute transgression. It is a total horror to take another person for whatever reason and enslave him. No matter what he looks like, no matter what his color is or what his thinking is. There is no justification for that. But again, that's how we must deal. What the Baruch Hashem will do is something else. If he feels that the tikkun or the rectification of these neshamas are necessary for these descendants to be enslaved, God will work the events of history so that full nations will find themselves in servitude to another. But that's not something that we can do. Amalek. There was a nation called Amalek who was a descendant from Esau. And what Amalek did was a terrible, terrible thing. What Amalek did when the Jews left Egypt and therefore totally overwhelmed every nation in the world at that time. Who would start up with the Jews after they walked out of Egypt? They had to be suicidal. After you saw what God did to Egypt, which is the most powerful nation on earth, who would pick up his hand against the Jews? No one, except Amalek. Why? Because Amalek had the specific ideology of it is better to die at war with God than to live at servitude with God. You see. There's an old line by Milton, it's better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. You see. And in a certain way, Amalek is a personification of that feeling. You see. Where Amalek said, of course we know if we go up against the Jews we may die. We're not stupid. We saw what they did to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians were one of the most powerful magicians at all. Amalek were very great magicians. But the Jews were greater magicians. The Egyptians were greater. And they saw what happened. They knew that. But they didn't care. It's not important to us. Because we cannot live in a world where the Jews dominate. We can't live in a world where what? When the concept of God and the concept of submission to God is something which must exist. We'd rather die. We'd rather war with God and die at his hand than sit there and submit to his will. This is the essence of what it is. That's in Amalek. So the Baruch Hashem said, because you've done that, because you have reached the highest level of arrogance, I will convert you to a new species. Now we find a very strange mitzvah in the Torah. One of the strangest of all. There is a mitzvah in the Torah that says that a Jew is obligated as one of the 613 commandments to identify an Amaleki and kill him on the spot. Man, woman, or child. It is irrelevant. It is a mitzvah essay in the Torah that if you can identify an Amalek, which is not possible, you are obligated to take a gun and shoot him in the head. Now that's a very deep thing. We will go into what this means. It sounds like a very strange thing. But what does this mean? Because it has to do with the concept of what Amalek became. This mitzvah never existed before Amalek attacked the Jews, but it did exist after Amalek attacked the Jews. Why? Because what the Baruch Hashem said was the following. What the Baruch Hashem said to Amalek, he said to the neshama, to the collective nefesh called Amalek, he said to him, because of what you have done, because of the fact you rebelled to me at what? At the sacrifice of death, something to see that's never to be a rasha. Therefore, I will allow you to be dovik to what you want to become. What he did was, he did something he never did to a human being. Up to now, I have told you that until Avraham, until Matan Torah, every person had the ability to create an Olam Haba, right? After Avraham Avinu, a Goy was created, and a Goy no longer had that ability. But Amalek did one better. What the Baruch Shem did was to create a human being without a Yetzer Tov. And Amalek is an individual who possesses no Yetzer HaTov. How is that possible? How? That's the neshama of an Amalek. That was the punishment of him. So therefore, if a Yisrael is a superhuman being because of the fact that his neshama can create Olam Haba, and if a Goy is simply a human being because of the fact that he has the capacity to live in this world and still have a Yetzer and Yetzer Tov because he has 7 mitzvahs, a Goy is non-human. And that's exactly what a Goy is. A Goy is a human being who looks human, who thinks like human being, but rather an Amalek is an individual who has no Yetzer Tov, none whatsoever. That's why the Torah says to kill an Amaleki. Why? Because now that we've created a new type of species of men who have no Yetzer Tov, all an Amalek wants to do is total arrogance. That's it. You want to find an Amalek? Probably Adolf Hitler, most likely. Very little doubt about it. It is a man who is bent on the destruction of God and the destruction of the Jews. And Amalek also, because of the fact that he has no Yetzer Tov, is the greatest spiritually sensitive person alive besides a Jew. You say, what am I talking about? Right? He should be an incredible Russia. But you don't understand the incredible spiritual depth of an Amaleki. What is the aspect of a tremendous tzaddik? A tzaddik who's worked up his Yetzer Tov to an incredible fashion understands the subtleties of goodness and Tov. He knows what Kedusha really is in its highest form. An Amalek, since he has no Yetzer Tov, knows what the spirituality is of Ra or evil. He is a purist. And because he's a purist, he is the exact opposite of the Jew. And Amalek will look at the Jew and know that this is my natural enemy. He will know it. Because an Amalek instinctively can smell a Yetzer Tov. Even though he doesn't have it, he can smell it. And as soon as he smells it, the first thing he wants to do is stomp on it. Get rid of it. It's like a metal detector. An Amalek knows the Jew better than the Jew knows himself. An Amalek knows what a Jew is about much better than Jews do. Much better. That's why Adolf Hitler, one of his generals at the end of World War II, were begging him and they were saying, what are you doing with these Jews? We're losing the war. Why are you taking all the trains and you're shifting them off? We need the trains what? To transport goods and military supplies and soldiers. Instead, Adolf Hitler made sure that the trains constantly were deporting Jews to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and so on. And he refused to what? To allot more trains to the military, even though they were losing the war. And the generals told them, what are you, crazy? We're losing this war. So Hitler said, no, the most important thing is to kill the Jews. And the Jews said he was right. Because that's what an Amalek must do. That's what he's built for. That's what he understands. That's his soul. His soul was composed of pure Ra or evil, who is the human personification of the Yetzer Hara in physical form, knows what his job is. His job is to eradicate the Yetzer Tov. And he knows that the Yetzer Tov exists in the Jew, because it is the Jew who's come down to the world and said, God, submission to God. It is the Jew who's created this entire idea. You see, and if the Amalek will understand this, and he says we must eradicate it, I don't care if I die. So what if I lose the war? Never stop the goal of killing the Jews. Hitler was no different than the Amalekites before. It's the exact same concept and the same procedure. There's nothing to be surprised at. It is because of the fact that Amalek is such a superior being when it comes to spirituality that he can smell a Yetzer Tov 1,000 miles away. And because of the fact that he's programmed to kill it, you see, that makes him so lethal to a Jew. So the Baruch Shem says, you must destroy an Amalek. Man, woman, and child. Because there's no difference. It's all the same type of person. But, wait. What the Baruch Shem says is the following. Is that the Mashiach cannot come until Amalek has been subjugated. You will not see your redemption until every Amalekite is destroyed. What the Baruch Shem says is the following. Just because I've commanded you to destroy an Amalek, that I've commanded you to destroy the natural enemy of a Jew, that doesn't mean I'm going to let you do it. You have to be worthy to do it. Because the eradication of Amalek is synonymous and identical with the eradication of what? Of the Yetzer Hara. Therefore, the final eradication of Amalek will not transpire until the ultimate redemption itself. And that's what it means when God says that what? That I command you to eradicate an Amalek, but not only that, the ultimate eradication of Amalek is dependent on the Gula, on the ultimate redemption. And that when the Jews merit the redemption, they will merit the eradication of evil, and therefore of every natural enemy in the world. But if they don't, they will not merit it, and there will be plenty of Amalekites running around doing their thing. You see, one more thing and we will conclude. The fact that an Amalekite is this kind of being, he's a non-human, he's a goy that's been even descended further to a non-human, leaves us with one last idea. If it were not for the existence of Amalek, the Jews would have been annihilated a long time ago. Amalek is the insurance policy. The existence of an individual called Amalek, the existence of an individual who wants to destroy a Jew, is the insurance policy that the Jews will survive. But that makes no sense. Because essentially what we're saying is that if I allow this homicidal maniac to exist, it is a guarantee that you will survive. If I allow this verdict, this guy who's running after you to kill you at every cost, that's the greatest guarantee that you will survive. What am I talking about? To understand that, you've got to understand much more about Anuvat HaYichud, and that's where we'll go into next time. Yes, question. Amalek. What happened was that there was something that did change drastically, because what it was is that Amalek is an extremely powerful nation, and as a powerful nation in terms of its inner neshama, it has the ability to war against the Jews and to do great damage if the Jews aren't careful. But there was a war between Amalek and Moshe and Klal Yisrael at the biblical times, and what Moshe succeeded in doing is weakening Amalek, so that Amalek now never again has the ability to really hurt Jews directly, only indirectly. And you find it instantaneously. I will get into say that even if certain perceptions that I have about the German people as a whole were not Amalekim. The only ones I believe that were the Amalekim really that came from Amalek was the SS, and the higher German hierarchy. You see, but the truth is they themselves could not really kill Jews, but they had the power to incite other goyim to kill Jews, and that's the power of Amalek. The power of Amalek today is that they have the ability to incite other goyim to kill Jews, but at a direct confrontation they can no longer do it because they made impotent to a large degree by Moshe Rabbeinu in the war at that time. But these go into very different matters, you see.